Hello, and welcome to the 11th edition of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's topic is a big one: China's rise to dominant status in sustainable energy. As readers of our LinkedIn posts already know, we spend considerable time thinking about China in our sustainable energy development strategies and often ask our readers to do the same. My goal today is to walk you through how China achieved its ascendant position, how the rest of the world is reacting, and what it all means for the future of the global clean energy transition. Let's dive in. When we talk about China's success in renewable energy, we're looking at multiple fronts. First, there's solar. China currently leads in solar panel manufacturing, controlling roughly 80% of the global supply chain for polysilicon, wafers, cells, and modules. This is the result of years of state-led industrial policies, where both the national government and provincial authorities offered tax incentives, cheap financing, and subsidies to solar companies that agreed to expand capacity and drive down costs. This ultra-competitive environment led to a massive scale-up, and in the process, many other manufacturers around the world found it increasingly tough to compete. While there's a positive angle to cheaper solar panels that accelerate global adoption, it also raises serious questions about whether we're sowing the seeds of a new energy dependency. China has employed a similar playbook in wind power. Manufacturers there account for around 65% of all new wind installations globally, with major players like Goldwind and Mingyang capturing huge market shares. This growth has again been fueled by strong government support, part of China's broader policy to develop strategic sectors. Interestingly, wind turbine exports have now begun to follow a path like solar, with Chinese giants pricing competitively and sometimes undercutting domestic players in the US or Europe. What's driving Beijing's unwavering commitment to these renewables? It's more than just environmental concern. In China's official economic development plans, particularly the most recent 5-year plans, sustainable energy takes center stage. The government views solar, wind, and more recently green hydrogen as avenues to solve multiple challenges at once: reduce fossil fuel dependence, curb pollution in cities, create high-value manufacturing jobs, and become the global leader in an industry that's bound to shape the next century. Essentially, they're not just going green for altruism's sake. They see a golden economic opportunity to dominate tomorrow's energy technologies. Green hydrogen is the most recent star in Beijing's sustainability constellation. We're seeing new targets for green hydrogen production of up to 100,000 to 200,000 tons annually by the end of this year, with further expansion planned through 2035. Inner Mongolia alone has announced intentions to produce nearly 500,000 tons of green hydrogen per year by the midpoint of this decade. For context, that's an enormous figure for a fuel that was virtually unheard of in common energy conversations just a few years ago, and is still struggling to find industrial adoption in the European Union and the United States. Hydrogen is crucial because it can decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors like steelmaking, shipping, and aviation. And if China nails down a low-cost green hydrogen supply chain first, particularly if powered by its cheap wind and solar, it could become the new Saudi Arabia of the hydrogen era, setting the rules and reaping the economic benefits. Now, if this was simply about the climate, you might say, fantastic. Let's let China build out the capacity and we'll all benefit from lower clean energy costs. But there's more to it, especially from the perspective of Europe and the United States. Both regions have climate agendas. Europe with its Green Deal, and the US still has the legacy investments from the pre-Trump administration funding via the Inflation Reduction Act. But neither has matched China's level of direct state-backed industrial planning. In Europe, we do have quite a few programs aimed at boosting local solar, wind, and battery manufacturing capacity. We've seen the new €100 billion Clean Industrial Bill emerge just this week, which aims to direct more funding into local green tech manufacturing. There's also talk of streamlining bureaucratic bottlenecks in the EU omnibus legislation to accelerate clean tech projects. The real question is whether these moves will suffice. Because let's face it, China does not just provide subsidies at a central government level. The entire network, from municipal to provincial to national authorities, is geared toward nurturing homegrown champions. Any competitor that tries to stand on its own 2 feet in a free market environment is going to have to acknowledge that it's far from a fair fight. The conversation gets even more interesting when we look at electric vehicles. China has shot ahead in EV manufacturing, with domestic brands like Build Your Dreams, BYD, leading the way. With the help of sustained government support in the form of tax breaks, consumer purchase incentives, and direct grants to automakers, Chinese EV makers have become powerhouses. As of 2023, China's new energy vehicle market surpassed 20 million vehicles, a number that continues to grow at an incredible rate. By 2035, the government aims for a huge percentage, possibly the majority, of car sales to be fully electric. Some projections suggest nearly all new car sales will be electrified, EV or hybrid, by 2035, and that's a target the EU and US are finding difficult to match. Just ask California amid its fight with the Trump administration over future EV targets, or Mercedes-Benz struggling with its sales and EV transition strategy amid a sluggish German industrial outlook. Soon, we might even hear from Elon Musk himself that things are not quite what they used to be at Tesla. China's EV push has had a ripple effect. Once Chinese automakers dominated their home market, the next logical step was to look abroad. Exports of Chinese EVs to Europe jumped by about 70% in 2023 alone, putting China in position to surpass Japan as the world's top car exporter overall. This is more than a bit unsettling for Western automakers, who are used to leading. You'll see signs of BYD promotions and advertising throughout Portugal, even in the Azores, as one small example. The frustration among EU and US officials centres on allegations that Chinese EVs aren't necessarily priced cheaper just because of labour cost advantages or economies of scale. Instead, they argue it's also a result of massive state intervention, which systematically rigs the game. And while Western governments do have their own EV incentives, it's often felt that the Chinese system can funnel capital directly into corporate expansions without the typical checks and balances, letting manufacturers lower their prices to an extent that's difficult for foreign rivals to match. That leads us to an uncomfortable question. Is this ultra-aggressive posture a serious threat to the world trading system? The Donald's Make America Great Again, tariffs imposing another 20% on Chinese imports into the US might have been a reactionary measure, but more reasonable national governments, even in Europe, seem to share a certain concern that global free trade is being undermined by heavy-handed state intervention in China. If international trade stops being about who can innovate the best and instead becomes about who can subsidize the most, the results for the global economy become unpredictable. And let's not forget batteries. The EV revolution is inextricably tied to battery technology, and China currently dominates that too, with contemporary Amperex technology coming limited, CATL, holding the largest global market share, around 36.8%. If you look at Chinese battery makers collectively, they control over 60% of the global supply. That's an astonishing figure, and it highlights why so many Western startups have had a tough time catching a break. CATL's scale, proximity to raw material refining, and direct government support make it incredibly difficult for rivals to compete on price. Some European battery ventures, like Northvolt, have tried to stay in the game and build up local battery supply chains. Yet we're seeing reports of huge financial stress in this space. The rumours about Northvolt nearing bankruptcy late last year, some vehemently denied, sadly turned out to be true as the company filed for bankruptcy restructuring in the US last November, underscoring the challenges of building big battery factories without consistent government support to take on KTL. The worry is that as one of Europe's flagship battery developers has stumbled, we could see the region losing any chance to build a local supply chain. And that sets up a dynamic where the entire West remains reliant on Chinese imports. Let's also consider the research and development angle. China invests an estimated $4 to $6 billion annually in clean energy R&D, including breakthroughs in solar, wind turbines, advanced batteries, and hydrogen technologies. Add to that the substantial funding for pilot projects, demonstration sites, and academic industrial partnerships, and you see a well-oiled machine. Chinese universities and research institutions are churning out patents and peer-reviewed papers at a remarkable pace, further entrenching China's hold on the technologies of tomorrow. Europe and the US have, of course, recognized the problem. In the US, the Inflation Reduction Act had earmarked hundreds of billions of dollars for climate and clean energy initiatives. But that's all been torched by the Donald in a MAGA bonfire. Still, we're seeing new, smaller battery plants spring up across the Midwest and Southeast. Automakers like Ford have created partnerships with KTL, ironically enough, to get local battery production going. Meanwhile, the EU is throwing its weight behind projects meant to create a local battery supply chain, especially in countries like Germany, France, and Sweden. But these efforts don't really threaten a behemoth like KTL. Such responses are unlikely to successfully chip away at China's dominance, especially as China keeps accelerating. With each new solar factory, wind turbine assembly line, and battery gigafactory that opens in China, the scale advantage grows, making it that much tougher for newcomers to catch up. Let's be clear, the West wants net zero carbon by mid-century, and we want to see a global shift to clean energy. The difference is whether we'll do that by being reliant on Chinese supply chains or by developing local, independent sources of technology and expertise. This is where strategic industrial policy, trade remedies, and investment in large-scale R&D all come into play. The big fear in Europe is that China, with its newly acquired capacity, will flood the European market with cheaper EVs, batteries, and renewable components, pushing local manufacturers over the edge. While it's beneficial for consumers to have lower-priced electric cars, it's damaging for any domestic industry that lacks the scale or government support to compete. That, in turn, erodes local skill bases, job creation, and economic sovereignty. Is it a level playing field? Western leaders increasingly say no. Some argue it's only fair to impose countervailing duties or other tariffs on Chinese green tech products to offset Beijing's lavish subsidies. I'm sure you are fighting back an image of the Donald in your mind right now. Others worry a tit-for-tat trade war could slow down the transition to clean energy exactly when the world needs it to accelerate. Amid these trade debates, Synergy International's stance is straightforward. We strongly support rapid decarbonisation wherever it comes from. Yet, in an ideal world, Europe and the US would have enough local capacity to ensure real competition and resilience. If China ends up monopolizing green energy production long-term, it would inevitably create both geopolitical tensions and supply bottlenecks. And let's remember that decarbonization is going to be easier, cheaper, and faster if multiple regions are innovating, manufacturing, and scaling solutions in parallel. A single dominant system will be first mover to push the envelope on cost reductions, but it risks over-concentration of critical technologies and know-how. So how can the EU fight back? One line of thought is that the EU needs to significantly ramp up its own support for local renewable industries. Our podcast last week highlighted the €100 billion Clean Industrial Bill, which is the most recent example of the EU acknowledging the scale of the challenge. By offering direct subsidies for domestic clean tech manufacturers, the EU hopes to narrow the gap with Chinese producers. Our episode 10 also highlighted the EU's move to streamline bureaucracy via its omnibus bill reforms. So projects like building a green hydrogen production facility don't require wading through endless permitting and green tape. The question is whether €100 billion is enough to spur matching private capital investments, and whether it arrives swiftly enough. Another angle is that the EU could adopt a more strategic approach to raw materials. One of China's strengths in batteries and solar panels stems from its dominance of the midstream processes for refining materials like lithium, cobalt, and polysilicon. Europe, if it wants to catch up, might need to invest heavily in local mines, or at least secure supply chains through international alliances outside China. Partnerships with resource-rich countries could be key, but that requires speed, diplomacy, and the willingness to invest in sometimes risky projects. Then there's the matter of trade rules. The European Commission has begun investigating alleged unfair trade practices, especially regarding Chinese EVs. It's possible we'll see more anti-dumping measures or tariffs if officials conclude that Chinese car makers are selling below cost. However, trade disputes can escalate, and if China responds in kind, we may enter a new era of green trade wars that hamper the global rollout of sustainable tech. Navigating that situation deftly will require a balance between protecting local industry and not derailing climate goals. In the United States, a conversation about government support for sustainable energy is just whistling in the dark with the Donald, now large and in charge. Over the past 4 years, the IRA tried to localize battery supply chains by offering consumer tax credits specifically for EVs with locally sourced components. This approach effectively nudged automakers to invest domestically or in free trade partner countries. Yet, that is now all over, and it's an open question whether any measures will emerge to reduce Chinese global dominance. Let's be honest enough to say that a national sustainable industrial policy in the US is now dead, and Beijing stands to benefit as it orchestrates its own green agenda, effectively free from US competition. Another critical point: research and development. If the EU or the US can leapfrog China in next-generation technologies, like solid-state batteries, new solar materials, or advanced hydrogen fuel cells, they could regain some lost ground. Right now, though, China's scale advantage in existing technologies let it plough more money into R&D, and there is a mounting attack on university research funding in the US. No extra credit for guessing who's behind it. That's another own goal for Team USA, allowing China to benefit from a self-reinforcing cycle. Dominate the present, reinvest the profits in the future. Breaking that cycle will require the West to think strategically about where and how to direct resources. So, where does this leave us? China's dominance in sustainable energy is not an accident. It's the product of a brilliant and deliberate industrial policy, spanning solar, wind, EVs, hydrogen, and a massive network of supporting infrastructure. By funneling resources into manufacturing, supply chains, and research at every step, China has entrenched itself as the go-to source for many of the technologies the world needs for decarbonization. This undeniably helps drive down costs globally, which is good for the planet, but it also raises legitimate concerns about fairness, security, and future innovation. As a champion of net zero policies, SYNI International firmly believes we should applaud any effort that reduces emissions and speeds up the green transition. Yet we also see that Europe, and one can only hope the US too at some point in the future, will need to step up its game if it wants to stay competitive, create jobs, and maintain technological know-how. Fortunately, Europe seems to be waking up, rolling out its clean industrial bill to turbocharge local manufacturing, and looking to streamline administrative processes via reforms to the EU omnibus legislation. The real question is whether these measures can match the scale of China's continuing surge. Time is tight, and the next few years will be crucial. Will Europe's new funding and legislative reforms allow it to build its own strong renewable energy and EV industry clusters, or is the momentum so firmly in China's favour that it's now unstoppable? Can the US ever recover from the Trump setbacks? And through all this, how likely is it that trade disputes do not slow the global race to net zero? It's not an easy puzzle to solve, but one thing is certain. The clean energy transition will shape economies, industries, and national policies for decades to come. China has made its intentions crystal clear, and it's now up to the rest of the world to decide how to respond, be that through deeper competition, more protective tariffs, strategic partnerships, or redoubled investment in local R&D. We at SYNI International will continue tracking every development closely, because the outcome will influence both the pace of decarbonisation and the global balance of industrial power. Well, that's a wrap on our 11th GreenWave podcast episode. Thanks for sharing your time with me and our SI team again this week. The pod can be found wherever you listen to your podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. And if you missed any of our LinkedIn posts or GreenWave Gazette this week, don't worry. You can catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or directly on our website, synergy-international.net. We'll continue to reflect on the major themes that guide sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.